October 2017. Africa. A small village in Niger called Tongo Tongo has become the closest thing to hell on earth. 50 ISIS insurgents jump out of their hiding places to carry out a brutal and bloody ambush against a convoy made up of local soldiers and US Special Forces. The attack is fast and merciless. The blood of the wounded soldiers begins to dye the desert red, and there seems to be no escape. In this new video from Military Force, we will learn about the fierce confrontation between the Islamic State and a group of fighters who were caught in the raging jihadist fire. Put on your helmet and join us in this story, but we warn you, only a few will be able to get out alive. The path to this brutal episode begins several years earlier, in 2013. Jihadist groups had an increasing presence in the Sahel region, an area that borders the Sahara Desert and the Sudanese savanna. Both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State militants began operating in countries like Niger and Mali, taking advantage of their porous borders and weak local governments to extend their influence. In that framework, the United States began to assist these nations with the aim of combating terrorist organizations and preventing their expansion. In addition to carrying out joint missions with its own soldiers and local forces, it began to develop training and intelligence support work. This is how we arrived at mid-2017. American troops landed in Niger to provide advice. However, in October of that same year, they received a tip about the possible location of a target that was on Uncle Sam's blacklist. It was a local jihadist named Dundun Shefu, an important member of ISIS in the region. To support the Nigerian fighters, a group of American Green Berets joined the operation to go after him. The data was scarce, but enough for the commanders to think it was a viable opportunity. Thus, the joint force embarked on the mission. The plan was simple. Reconnaissance was to be conducted, followed by a possible capture and a quick retreat. However, the challenging arid lands of the Sahel added a degree of difficulty to the job. On October 4th, the convoy was ready to depart. Before dawn, several vehicles began their journey along dusty roads that seemed endless on the horizon. The vast desert surrounded them, along with a silence that was only broken by the roar of the engines. The Nigerian soldiers were tense, exchanging glances full of uncertainty as the sun began to rise in the sky. The Americans, although more experienced, also seemed uneasy. There was something in the air, a latent sense of danger that everyone shared, but that no one dared to mention. Beyond that thought, the group continued onward and would soon reach Tongo Tongo. Although the village seemed like just another point on the map, a violent surprise awaited them there. The Islamic State jihadists watched the convoys advance from the shadows. They were in position, lurking like patient predators, ready to strike.
Anybody in? Anybody hit? Are y'all okay?
Suddenly, a storm of fire descended on the American and Nigerian forces. The trap had become reality. American Sergeants Jeremiah Johnson, Brian Black, Dustin Wright, and LaDavid Johnson immediately grouped together upon hearing the first bullets of the ferocious ambush. The war cries of the jihadists echoed in the air, and the sharp sound of AK-47 rifles ricocheted off the hills as a paralyzing fear invaded the bodies of the men under attack. The insurgents moved like shadows, fast and deadly, hiding behind rocks and vegetation. The bullets that left their weapons whistled around the Americans, hitting the sheet metal of the trucks, causing sparks and metal fragments to fly. Chaos broke out in a matter of seconds. The wave of fire reached the Nigerian soldiers first, who began to collapse one by one like dolls. Their blood ran across the sandy ground as corpses shook under the onslaught of each impact. Screams of pain and desperate orders sowed further confusion among the victims of the ferocious ambush. The jihadists knew exactly where to strike, how to move, and when to press. They had studied the terrain and their enemy, and now they executed their offensive with terrifying precision. On the other side of the burst of fire, the joint US-Nigerian force tried to find cover, but there was not enough. They were completely exposed, trapped in open terrain and surrounded by 50 of the most brutal ISIS fighters. Under other circumstances, the American team would have been prepared to offer an effective response, but the sheer surprise of the attack completely disorganized them. Still, the Green Berets in the vehicles knew that the only way to escape was to fight to the end, so they grabbed their rifles and launched into action.
Footage of that fight shows that 2 American vehicles are separated from the convoy. The others had fled or were hit. We see 7 soldiers taking cover. The attackers are somewhere in this area. An American soldier, we believe to be Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson, wearing a helmet camera, enters the white vehicle and drives it a short distance. He steps out and begins firing towards the tree line.
Jeremiah Johnson felt a sharp stab in his leg that sent him reeling. An enemy bullet struck him, ripping through his body. Ignoring the pain, he continued to walk alongside one of the vehicles. His breathing was rapid and labored as he moved, holding his gun in his hands and trying to locate the attackers. However, the insurgents were like specters, appearing and disappearing among the rocks, firing precise shots from all directions. Dustin Wright was at his side, trying to cover him while Jeremiah desperately searched for the attackers and spit fire incessantly from his rifle. Despite the panic that gripped the situation, the Americans made firm movements, such as reloading their weapons with cold, calculating precision. Training had prepared them for this moment where only a thin line separates life from death. However, it was difficult to assimilate that each step they took could be their last. After several minutes, the air smelled of gunpowder and burning flesh. The desperation of men who knew the end was near was palpable. The crossfire intensified. Bullets continued to hit the convoy's vehicles with violence. The attackers, well organized and experienced in guerrilla tactics, surrounded the soldiers like predators stalking wounded prey. Confidence in them grew, and the Americans' alternatives seemed to vanish in the hot desert air. Meanwhile, the Nigerians who had not died in the first seconds of the attack ran aimlessly in search of a non-existent shelter. Terror ruled their actions. Some wandered around bloodied by the shots they had received, and others simply waited for the final blow that would take their lives. Unlike them, the American troops would not give up so easily.
Wright drives the car toward the mark of a red smoke grenade. The smoke could be to mask their movements from the militants, or to mark their position for supporting units. Johnson, taking cover at the rear, fires toward the tree line.
The U.S. soldiers' body cameras allow them to follow the slow movement towards the hopeful red cloud in first person. When the ambush broke out, the commandos called for reinforcements by radio. Although they were aware that the arrival of air support could take a while, they maintained the illusion of withstanding the onslaught long enough to survive. In other words, that was their only option. The enemy was closer, and every second gained was an oasis of hope for the resisting forces. The hearts of the U.S. soldiers were beating wildly. Suddenly, the horror of being trapped by the enemy ambush increased when the Special Forces troops realized that a member of the group was missing. Black Wright and Jeremiah Johnson looked into each other's eyes for an answer, hoping that one of them could utter the words, "He is safe." But that was not the case. Sergeant LaDavid Johnson had been separated from the others. He did not have the protection of the improvised trench of the vehicles. He ran alone, his rifle pointed at nothing, trying to find cover in the middle of the desert landscape. He knew that if he stopped, he would be nothing more than an easy target for the insurgents. He continued aimlessly until his legs gave out and his lungs felt like they were about to burst. All he found were some bushes full of thorns that he decided to sneak into. However, the jihadists followed his steps like hungry wolves and shot him continuously no matter where he was. Finally, the beasts caught up with their prey. The fierce ISIS fighters executed him mercilessly. David Johnson was shot in the head and chest. His remains were desecrated after his death, with the attackers attacking him even after the last breath left his body. His bullet-riddled corpse was left at the mercy of desert scavengers under the scorching African sun. Now, while the tragic and brutal fate of this soldier was being consummated, his comrades were still fighting for their lives. Back at the makeshift defense line, the other 3 Americans are trying to resist the violence of the Islamic State fighters. Brian Black had been shot several times in the chest, but his bulletproof vest was still holding up. Despite that, the attack left him breathless and confused. He was trying to stay calm, but he couldn't concentrate amid the carnage caused by the ambush. Suddenly, Dustin Wright appears on the scene to drag him behind the vehicle that still protects them from the firestorm. The situation was desperate. The numerical and tactical superiority of the jihadists was overwhelming. The Green Beret team was brave, but their time was running out. Little by little, dozens of insurgents approached the position held by the 3 Americans. Black is again hit by enemy bullets, but this time he ends up seriously wounded. With his dying breath, he orders his comrades to flee. However, retreat seems impossible. The gunshots continue to ring out, but the soldiers' screams begin to subside. The ISIS attack is achieving its objective. Jeremiah Johnson is the next to be hit by the insurgent projectiles, and Wright tries to cover for him with a final heroic act.
The situation is too desperate. Johnson is seriously wounded and falls, but then moves about another 40 feet. Militant fire seems to be coming from this area. Wright stops running and shoots. A short time later, 2 armed militants appear on screen. Johnson appears to be unconscious. Still, he's shot by the militants at close range. Staff Sergeant Wright dies just feet away.
The flames of hell began to die down. Silence once again dominated the scene in the Tongo Tongo desert as the ISIS militants disappeared as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only traces of devastation and death. The bodies of the 4 American Special Forces soldiers were joined by the remains of 5 other Nigerian soldiers left behind. Hours later, when reinforcements and recovery teams finally arrived, what they found was a nightmare scene. Mutilated bodies, charred vehicles, and the echo of a battle that should never have happened. The sacrifice of the Green Berets went down in history as a warning of the cruelty and chaos that awaited in the shadows of African terrorism. As support troops picked up the remains of their fallen comrades, they knew something had gone terribly wrong, that the disaster could have been avoided. But it was too late. However, the brutality of the attack and the way the American fighters were eliminated raised a flood of questions in Washington. These losses sent shockwaves through the country and led to a public debate about the American military presence in Africa. Memorials were held in every corner of the nation to pay tribute to the fallen, and their families were joined by the entire people in their grief. Beyond the criticism for sending American soldiers to fight battles that do not belong to them, none of the claims or questions to the authorities will bring the dead back to life. The bodies of the Green Berets were sent back home, wrapped in flags, while their loved ones faced the horror of the details about the cruel murders. Now, after having learned this tragic story of a bloody and lethal ISIS ambush, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We hope to see you again in our next military force video.